Get ready for a trip back in time, folks, because today we are diving deep into Pompeii and Herculaneum. And lucky for us, we've got excerpts from this really fascinating book, Pompeii and Herculaneum's Roman Secrets, to guide us. It's basically our backstage pass to life in these Roman cities, before disaster struck.
Yeah, and what makes these cities so special is that they weren't just abandoned, they were literally frozen in time by Mount Vesuvius. It's like a snapshot of Roman society that we just don't get anywhere else.
Okay, so we can't really talk about Pompeii and Herculaneum without mentioning, the volcano in the room. So what exactly went down back in 79 AD?
It wasn't just any eruption, it was a Plinian eruption.
Plinian.
Yeah, named after Pliny the Elder, who, well, witnessed it. Actually, he ended up becoming one of its victims, which kind of shows you how powerful these things are.
Wow, so this Pliny guy, was he just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was he trying to, get a closer look?
Oh, he wasn't just a bystander. Pliny the Elder was a Roman author, kind of a natural philosopher, a science enthusiast. He actually sailed right toward the eruption. He wanted to see it up close and maybe even help with evacuations. I mean, talk about dedication to research, right?
That's incredible. But sadly, it cost him his life. So what makes a Plinian eruption different from, your average volcano blowing its top?
Think scale and intensity. We're talking a massive column of ash and gas shooting, like tens of kilometers into the sky. That's higher than most planes fly today. And when that column eventually collapses, it sends these superheated gas and debris just cascading down the mountain. It's unbelievably fast.
So it's not just the lava, it's these pyroclastic flows, right? They're like super fast, super hot avalanches of volcanic material. No wonder they were so deadly.
Exactly. And for Pompeii and Herculaneum, the eruption went on for 2 days. It rained ash and pumice, and then those pyroclastic flows just surged through, burying everything. I mean, it's just mind-blowing, the terror people must have felt.
And to make matters even worse, the eruption also caused a tsunami in the Bay of Naples. Talk about a 1-2 punch.
It was a total disaster. The scale is just something we can hardly imagine today. But it's that same devastation that actually preserved Pompeii and Herculaneum. It created these incredible time capsules of Roman life.
So for centuries, these cities were completely buried and forgotten. How did they resurface? Was it like some dramatic, Indiana Jones type of discovery?
Not quite. Back in the late 1500s, this architect, Domenico Fontana, he stumbled upon the ruins of Pompeii while he was working on a canal project. But it wasn't until 1748 that they really started digging seriously.
So it took a while for people to realize what they had found. What sparked the interest after all that time?
Well, imagine you're digging, and suddenly you find a perfectly preserved Roman fresco or a house with everyday objects just as they were left, almost 2,000 years ago. You can't just ignore that. It was like finding a lost world.
And I bet there was some treasure hunting involved too, right?
Oh, absolutely. In the beginning, the focus was on digging up valuables. But over time, thankfully, archaeologists realized that meticulous documentation and preservation were much more important. They started carefully recording everything: the layout of the city, the architecture, and all the objects they found.
So they went from treasure hunters to historians, trying to piece together life in these lost cities. And that's where Pompeii and Herculaneum's Roman Secrets comes in, right? This book seems like the ultimate guide to understanding these places.
It really is. It paints this incredibly vivid picture of these Roman towns. It covers everything from the grand villas of the wealthy to the more humble homes of ordinary folks. It's got everything: daily routines, social customs, political systems, religious beliefs. It even tells the stories of specific individuals using inscriptions, letters, even graffiti.
That's amazing. It's not just about bricks and mortar. It's about the people who actually live there. So, before we jump into the daily life in Pompeii and Herculaneum, let's set the stage. How did people in these cities start their day? Was it anything like how we start our mornings today?
Welcome back to Pompeii and Herculaneum. We've been talking about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the rediscovery of these cities, and it's also interesting when you think about the insights we have today because of sources like Pompeii and Herculaneum's Roman Secrets.
And before we get into the details of daily life, I'm curious, were Pompeii and Herculaneum basically twin cities, or were there some key differences between them?
That's a great question. They were both Roman towns, thriving under the shadow of Vesuvius, but they each had their own unique character. Pompeii, it was a bustling port city. Think commerce and trade with a really diverse population, kind of a little rough around the edges, but full of life and activity.
So the New York City of its day.
Yeah, something like that. Herculaneum, on the other hand, it was wealthier, more resort-like. Lots of elite Romans with their fancy villas there, like vacation homes for the rich and famous.
Ah, so Herculaneum was like the Hamptons, a place to get away from it all.
Exactly. But even with those differences, they both offered a glimpse into Roman society. The social hierarchy, their love of leisure and entertainment, and their amazing ingenuity.
Speaking of social hierarchy, I know our listener wanted to hear more about that. Pompeii and Herculaneum's Roman secrets really gets into those class distinctions, right?
It does. Roman society was super hierarchical,
Good.
very structured. At the top, you had the senatorial elite and the wealthy landowners, the ones with those lavish villas we talked about in Herculaneum. They held a lot of power, both political and economic.
And below them were the equestrians, right?
Yeah.
Like the upper middle class of Roman society.
Yeah, you got it. They were often involved in business and trade, and some even held political positions. Then you had the ordinary citizens, the shopkeepers, the craftspeople, the laborers, the backbone of the society.
And then, unfortunately, at the very bottom, there were the slaves, who had no rights and were completely dependent on their owners.
It's a tough reminder about the inequalities back then, but there was this fascinating group called the freedmen, former slaves who earned or been granted their freedom. They could own businesses, make money, and even move up the social ladder, even though it was definitely not easy.
So there was a bit of hope for social mobility, even in that rigid system.
Yeah.
It's interesting that Pompeii and Herculaneum's Roman secrets mentions how many freedmen were successful. They owned businesses, some even became patrons of the arts.
Yeah, shows their resilience and determination, right? And it adds another layer to how we understand Roman society. It wasn't just black and white, haves and have-nots. There were shades of gray and a chance for things to change, even for those who started at the very bottom.
And let's not forget the women of Pompeii and Herculaneum. What were their lives like?
Well, Roman women played a more nuanced role than we might think. While they didn't have political power and were mostly expected to run the household, they could own property and businesses. They were involved in their husbands' or fathers' businesses, and some ran their own.
So they weren't just stuck at home all the time.
No, not at all. There's even evidence they were active in their communities. They were part of religious festivals, they went to the theater, and even owned and ran shops. Some things suggest that they even had a say in local politics, even though they couldn't vote officially.
That really challenges the stereotype of Roman women as completely powerless. It's so interesting to see those glimpses of their influence, even in a patriarchal system.
It definitely makes you think about their world differently, and makes you wonder what else we might find out as they keep digging. But how about we switch gears for a bit and talk about something a little more fun fashion? What did people wear in Pompeii and Herculaneum? Did they have their own version of haute couture?
I love that. Yeah, I can picture those togas flowing in the wind, but was that really all they wore?
Togas, yeah, they were around, especially for formal stuff and for men with, well, a certain social status. But everyday clothes were definitely more practical.
So what did the average person in Pompeii wear on a normal day?
For women, the stola was like the go-to outfit. A long flowing dress, usually linen or wool that could be draped in different ways. A bit like a more versatile toga. Oh, and don't forget the accessories. Makeup and perfume were big, and women loved their jewelry, hairpins, even elaborate wigs.
Wigs, seriously.
Yeah, they were all the rage in ancient Rome, especially for the wealthy women. Made from real hair sometimes and even dyed different colors. And hairstyles were a big deal too. Braids, buns, curls, they went all out.
Sounds like they were just as into fashion as we are, but I imagine their shopping trips were a bit different from ours.
Definitely. No online shopping or department stores back then. Instead, they headed to the Forum, the central marketplace, and the main gathering spot in town. Picture this. Vendors selling their stuff, shoppers haggling over prices, and the latest gossip flying around.
Sounds pretty lively. What kind of things could you find at the Forum?
Pretty much anything you can think of. Food, of course, fresh produce, bread, cheese, meat, fish. But also clothing, fabrics, pottery, jewelry, tools, furniture. Sadly, even slaves. There were workshops where people made their goods too.
So kind of a one-stop shop for everything you need, like a farmer's market, a mall, and a craft fair, all in one.
You got it. And it wasn't just about shopping. It was the heart of their political and social scene too. This is where they held elections, gave speeches, made announcements.
A mix of business, politics, and just hanging out sounds fascinating. Speaking of hanging out, what did people do for fun, in their downtime?
The Romans were all about entertainment. The amphitheater in Pompeii was a huge attraction. Just picture thousands of people packed in there cheering for their favorite gladiators. They'd be fighting each other or wild animals.
Wow, it's crazy to think those gladiatorial combats we read about were happening right there, in that very spot.
Pretty brutal stuff, but people loved it. And for those who wanted something a bit less, well, intense, there was the theater. Plays, comedies, tragedies, musical performances, something for everyone.
And of course, what Roman town would be complete without its baths?
You know it, the baths were about so much more than just getting clean. It was their social hub, the place to relax, gossip, exercise, even do business. Think pools with different temperatures, hot, warm, cold, and then steam rooms, saunas, massage rooms. They even had libraries and gardens in some of them.
Sounds like a pretty luxurious spa experience, a mix of ancient and modern-day pampering. They really knew how to relax.
Oh, for sure. And the baths were open to everyone, although the richer folks had fancier setups. But it was a place where you could kind of forget about social differences, at least while you were enjoying a nice soak.
Okay, so we've covered shopping, entertainment, relaxing. What about the more personal side of things? Did Pompeii and Herculaneum's Roman secrets talk about things like love, marriage, family life?
It does. And it shows us that Roman society had different views on sexuality and morality than we do today. For example, the fact that there were brothels in Pompeii makes us think about how they viewed these matters.
That's a good point. We can't really judge the past by today's standards, right? What was totally normal back then might seem shocking or even wrong to us now.
Exactly. And by exploring those differences, we can understand Roman culture in a deeper way. It's not about agreeing or disagreeing with them. It's about trying to see things from their point of view.
It's a reminder that history isn't just dates and battles. It's about how people lived their lives, their relationships, and what they believed in.
Right. And speaking of beliefs, Romans placed a lot of value on family and ancestry. Marriage was often seen as a practical thing, a way to keep the family going and build alliances.
So it wasn't always about love and romance.
Oh, they definitely had love. There are love poems and inscriptions from Pompeii and Herculaneum that prove that. But marriage was definitely a practical matter a lot of the time, especially for the upper classes.
That's interesting. Makes you wonder what those love poems and inscriptions were really all about, huh? Pure emotions or something more?
Mm.
But let's not get too sidetracked. We've covered a lot of ground already, from social structure and fashion to entertainment and family life.
Yeah, and we've only just begun. There's so much more to discover about the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum. But for now, let's just take a minute to think about what we've learned.
What really stands out to me is how Pompeii and Herculaneum's Roman secrets shows us how much our lives are like theirs in some ways. They didn't have smartphones and the internet, but they still loved being part of a community. They cared about fashion, and they worried about their families in the future, just like we do. It makes them seem much more, well, human, don't you think? Welcome back to our deep dive into Pompeii and Herculaneum. It's incredible how much we've learned about these Roman towns, from their social lives and what they wore, to how they entertained themselves, and even their views on love and marriage. But I think it's amazing how we can still relate to them even after all these centuries.
I agree. Pompeii and Herculaneum's Roman Secrets does a great job of showing those connections across time. It's a good reminder that even though technology changes and empires rise and fall, people are still people, you know? We have the same basic desires, the same fears, the same hopes for the future.
And speaking of the future, I was thinking about how Pompeii and Herculaneum fit into the whole Roman Empire picture. Were they just small towns, or do they have a bigger role to play?
They were actually pretty important, especially Pompeii. Its location right on the Bay of Naples made it a major center for trade. Stuff from all over the Mediterranean came through Pompeii's port. It really fueled their economy and connected them to the rest of the Roman world.
So it wasn't just some sleepy little town. It was a busy hub full of merchants and sailors and all sorts of people coming and going.
Exactly. And both Pompeii and Herculaneum were big on agriculture, too. All that fertile land around them produced wine, olives, all kinds of crops. They used it locally and exported it, too, which added to the wealth of the area and the empire.
It's fascinating to see how these towns were actually important parts of the Roman Empire's success.
And their political systems show that, too. Both towns had their own local governments with elected officials who took care of civic stuff, kept things in order, made sure daily life ran smoothly.
So even though they were part of the Roman Empire, They still had some independence. They weren't just taking orders from Rome all the time.
Right. They had their own councils, magistrates, and ways of settling disputes and making decisions that affected their communities. Obviously, the Roman emperor was ultimately in charge, but on a day-to-day basis, Pompeii and Herculaneum had a lot of control over their own affairs.
And it sounds like the people there really cared about their civic duty. Pompeii and Herculaneum's Roman Secrets says that political campaigns were pretty intense, with candidates competing for votes and using all sorts of tactics to win people over.
Oh, yeah, it was a big deal. Election posters, slogans on walls, even gladiatorial games sponsored by politicians sounds familiar, right? They even had negative campaigning where candidates would try to ruin their opponents' reputations.
It's funny how some things never change. But who actually got to vote in those elections? Was it like today where pretty much everyone can vote?
Not quite. Only men could vote, and they had to own a certain amount of property, so it was a very limited kind of democracy, nothing like what we have today.
It's a good reminder that progress isn't always a straight line. Even a great civilization like Rome had its flaws. But even with those flaws, they did some amazing things. Just think about their government, their buildings, and their culture. Pompeii and Herculaneum are proof of their ingenuity and their art.
Absolutely. Their architecture was incredible. From the Forum and the Babs to those beautiful private villas with their mosaics and frescoes, they really knew how to build things that lasted. And look at them, they're still standing after all this time, even after a volcano.
And it's not just the big buildings that get to me. It's the everyday objects that were buried in the ash and preserved, the tools, the pottery, the toys, even loaves of bread and ovens. Those things really connect us to the people who use them. It makes you realize they were a lot like us.
It's those little details that make Pompeii and Herculaneum so fascinating. It's not just about the ruins themselves, it's about the stories they tell, the lives they show us, the window they give us into a world that's both ancient and surprisingly familiar.
And what's even cooler is that they're still excavating these sites, still finding new things, and learning more about Roman life. It's like a never-ending mystery novel where each new clue gets us closer to the truth.
And that's what makes archaeology so exciting. There's always a chance of finding something new, something that changes how we see the past, something that links us to the people who came before us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Pompeii and Herculaneum, what are some things you hope our listeners will think about?
I hope they'll think about how fragile civilizations can be, how our experiences connect us to people across time, and how resilient humans can be, how we adapt and create even when faced with huge challenges.
Well said. And to our listeners, this is just the beginning. There are so many more stories waiting to be discovered in Pompeii and Herculaneum. What fascinated you the most in this deep dive? What would you like to explore further? What mysteries of the Roman world would you like to uncover next? Thanks for joining us on this journey.